TJ. So today I am having this tea. It's called yellow tea. I had it a few years back from this company called Tivana, which they're no longer in business now. But it's really, it's so delicious. I'm trying to describe the flavor profile. It's a little nutty, um, but it's kind of similar to like an oolong tea where it has that lightness on it. But it's so delicious. It's also really hard to find. I bought a lot of it when Tivana was going out of business. So I'm currently working through my last little bit of it. But I wanted to revisit something from a previous episode where we talked about the power of our yes, because it made me go back to this book that I read a few years ago called The Year of Yes by Chandra Rhimes. And I remember when I read that book the first time, how informative it was and how I had never really perceived my life that way, and how I had never really understood the power of my yeses and how important that is to understand as you're walking through this life. And I think, generally speaking, um, we have this idea of how saying yes to new opportunities can lead to, bigger and greater things in life, right? But I think it's more than just saying yes to something or like accepting an invitation to something or saying yes to an opportunity or a job. It, to me at least, it really opens yourself up to the possibilities that life has to offer. And I think that is where that's what I took away from her book. Because she talks about it. If you've never read it, it's a really easy read. But in her book, she talks about how she went through this challenge one year while she was, working on all of her shows on like Scandal and Grey's Anatomy and How to Get Away with Murder. Um, she was working on all of these things, and anytime someone asked her to like speak or do an interview or go out, the answer was always no. And so she challenged herself in that year to learn to say yes to things, no matter what it was, no matter how scary it was, how uncomfortable it was, just to say yes to see what would happen. It was an experiment for herself. And I found it really, really interesting, because I think up until that point in my life, I said yes to things because I'm such a go with the flow type of person. Um, Most people who know me know that I don't usually make decisions. I'm very much like, oh, where you want to go to eat? You can choose. I can eat anywhere. I can find something. Right. I can make do with anything, no matter where I am. It's just how I grew up and how I learned to operate in the world. But I, in reading her book, and especially going back to it the second time, it really just it reinformed me how powerful your yes can be and how you can kind of like hack your life in a way by just being open and receptive to things, right? And not closing yourself off um, by saying no to things. But then it also kind of taught me the power of my nose too, which is we'll get to that at the end of the episode. But I recall a moment where I started implementing this in my life after the first time I read the book. And it was like a weekend getaway with some friends in New York. And I remember prior to then, you know, my my line was, well, I don't have any money, I'm an actor, right? I don't have the funds to just pick up and go, or I can't take off work because I need the money. And I'm trying to remember where we went. I think it was like the Poconos. It was somewhere close. Like it wasn't that far. But I remember whatever was happening in that moment that I was like, you know what? I could use a break. Sure. Fine. Yes. And when I tell you it was an amazing experience. I'm closer to that group of friends now. Um, it allowed me to get out of my head a little bit of like the stuff that I was dealing with at that time. And some great relationships were forged in that time period because it wasn't just my friends, it was like my friends and friends of friends. So I was introduced to a whole new group of people that I wouldn't have if I had said no. And I remember hesitating and thinking to myself, like, okay, we're gonna go to the woods, no cell service, nothing to do. Like, don't get me wrong, I love nature, but I love nature when I'm in control of the situation. Um, so giving up, the planning and the activities and all that up to someone else to put in all that detail and plan for us so that we were just showing up to have fun, it was a little frightening for me. um, but I remember getting there, and I remember getting out of the car and seeing the trees and being like, "Oh, this is kind of beautiful." Like, there's like a little lake over there. The air is crisp. Um, it was a nice feeling to like start the weekend off. And fast forward, we come back, and I remember all through that week carrying that trip with me and thinking, I was like, wow, I might have said no to this. I can't believe that I considered saying no to this. And like, it was probably the best 48 hours at that time in my life. And I didn't know that my body needed it. And that experience just showed me the level of vulnerability that is required for you to say yes to something. And how oftentimes that means stepping out of your comfort zone, and things, can be scary. But it's those moments of vulnerability that in my opinion, I feel like we discover our strengths. We discover that we're much stronger than we think we are, that we're more receptive than we think we are, um, and that we can actually handle a lot more than we think we can. And truthfully, it has me thinking about, I know we covered this in a previous episode, but it has me thinking about another job opportunity that I said yes to more recently in the past like 3 or 4 years, where I teetered between taking it and not taking it because at the time I was like, well, this is a great opportunity. It will allow me to achieve certain things on my checklist and put me in a position to be stronger when I come back from this job. However, it will also take me out of the city and take me out of the mix to audition for certain things that I've been keeping my eye on. And I remember, whew, I remember getting settled at that new job and, starting the contract. And about like 3 months into it, when I was just, running the show every day, how rewarding it was to look back and say, I said yes to this. And it's been, it has surpassed any expectation that I had going into it. And it really has allowed me to breathe and take a break from the city that I didn't know that I needed until I got there. And that's what I mean by like sometimes the vulnerability of your yes can lead to the discovery of your strengths. Like that, saying yes to that contract and being away for that year, I learned so much about myself in that time frame. And I knew, I figured out that my short term memory is actually much better than I think it is, because we learned the show in, I think it was like 14 days. It might have been less than that. Like, I think we only had like 3 days of on book rehearsal, and we went into blocking the show. And within the first week, we knew the show, and it was just up on its feet. And, granted, most theatrical endeavors have a similar timeline. If it's a brand new show, you usually get at least 2 weeks of on book rehearsal before you get off book. But I remember that experience. And when I got to the end of that process of just being on stage, thinking to myself, wow, I learned a show in 6 days. That's the fastest that I've ever learned a show. Um, and it opened my mind and showed me that I actually do have strengths in certain avenues of my career like that. And I wouldn't have known that if I had not said yes to this project. It taught me the power of my nose and the vulnerability of my nose as well, in that, wherever your stance is on your character or your performance level or the value of you as an individual, like how important it is to say no and to not feel like you've missed out because you've said no. For the first time for me, that experience specifically, for the first time for me, it taught me about boundaries and how important it is to have certain boundaries, because to a certain degree, some people can take advantage of your yes, right? And not necessarily have your best interest because you say yes to something. They're only concerned with what they can get out of the situation because you said yes. In realizing that I'm allowed to say no to things, um, really shifted my frame of thinking, and opened up, I think, really more opportunities for myself to be able to really dig into this well of creativity and this well of self worth, and really allow myself to say, you know what? Thank you for that. But I don't think that project is the right fit for me. And I think sometimes we allow ourselves to say yes to things and be vulnerable and say yes to things that aren't actually meant for us, where it's meant to teach you in that moment the difference between your yes and your no. Coming out of that experience, it really opened up this idea, and this knowledge of like, it's okay for me to say no to something. And no one's going to be mad. No one's going to be upset. I mean, obviously, if you do it in a respectful way, and you're not flying off the handle, like people will respect you more because you concisely said, you know what? I don't think this is actually for me. Thank you so much for the opportunity, but I think there's someone else better for the job, but keep me in mind for future projects or something else. Because then that'll potentially lead to, a job that later on down the line is actually right for you. And they will remember, oh, this person like knew exactly what their brand was. They knew exactly, their position in the world or their position in this industry, to concisely say, oh, that's not for me. But I know that they're right for these other three things. But the no really informed me on what ultimately matters for me, like as far as long-term goals. And it allows me to focus on those types of things and how to actually excel in those areas. Because I do believe that, sometimes when we say yes to something that isn't meant for us and we don't say no to it, it can be a hindrance to our growth. Now you have something in front of you that is not necessarily in line with your long-term goals, but because you've said yes to it and because you're committed to seeing that certain thing through, you kind of put all of your other ideas and dreams on the back burner in order to get through this opportunity. And understanding the power of my nose as well, I feel very strongly that like saying no is really saying yes to your own well-being. And with that being said, I will say that, to truly empower your yes, to really give vulnerability and intention behind your yes, you might have to be uncomfortable. Sometimes in those moments where things are uncertain, the yes becomes the compass, the yes becomes the directional force to get you back on track. like moving to a city where, I didn't have family, I didn't have a immediate friend base. I was going into the unknown, right? Starting from scratch, leaving Chicago, moving to New York. I didn't know anyone. It was challenging. Um, but it was a chance to reinvent myself, to rebrand myself, to discover all of these like new passions, new ideas. And, it coincided with, a certain level of like me coming into my adulthood at the time. But it really allowed me to discover new passions and discover hobbies, things that were outside of this um, built-in structure of like me trying to pursue theater. And so those yeses that came after being here for so many years, it really kind of helped me embrace the unknown, because sometimes things you say yes to, you're going in blind. And that is me being unfiltered and completely honest, is that some things you say yes to, there is no expectation, there is no real idea of, what this thing could be. And I think if you allow yourself to be vulnerable and to say yes to the unknown, everything that is meant to be in alignment will align, because you allowed yourself to be present and say yes to those things. And I mean that in the sense that when you when you allow yourself to be vulnerable and to say yes to something that is scary or unknown, and you've done all of this homework of knowing who you are, and building these dreams and doing all of these micro steps to make sure that you're on track, the yes will like the yes will act like a guardrail to keep you in line with those ideas that you have. So I want to read a quote from the book for you. Happiness comes from being who you actually are instead of who you think you are supposed to be. So I want you to take that with you today, friends. And remember that saying yes is not about accepting invitations. It's about embracing life's possibilities, right? And really understanding the empowerment of your yes, and the beauty and the vulnerability of your yes, and remembering that no also has its own strength. And it can teach you a lot with just being able to stand firm in your decision to say no to something. And that sometimes being comfortable in the uncomfortable, it's what's going to actually propel you forward. Because truthfully, life throws so much at you. And if you can get to a place and a level of vulnerability to say yes and or no to something, you'll be fine. And on that note, I'll talk to you next week.